We just had a Friday the 13th pass us by, and I love it when it lands in October of all months. And I can't think of a better way of celebrating it than by ranking the various ways that Jason has met his demise in the Friday the 13th films. Before I start, however, I'd be remiss if I didn't give a brief personal history of my experience and my introduction to the series. Like a lot of Jason fans, I'm sure I watched these movies when I was way too young, and as such, I was scared shitless of the woods for most of my life. I can still remember the first time that I saw a Friday the 13th film. I was maybe 4 or 5 years old. I was coincidentally enough with a cousin of mine named Jason, and we were watching part 3. I remember it so vividly because of the scene near the end of the film where Jason is unmasked and he's in the window looking down at Chris. His face obviously scared me, but it was the scene that followed which has been burned into my mind for years. That short moment put a fear in me that has persisted into my adult life, an innate fear of being chased or hunted. Now that I'm an adult and I've watched and rewatched every movie in the franchise more times than I care to admit, I consider myself an expert of sorts in all things Friday the 13th. I won't say that I know every little detail of every movie or can name every actor in the movies, but I've done many deep dives into the behind-the-scenes documentaries and all of the old DVD and Blu-ray special features. Having said that, I think it's time to dive in and rank every quote-unquote death that Jason has been subjected to in the series. A few things I want to throw out up front. Jason's original drowning won't be counted here as a death. We're only talking about everything after part 1, and Roy's imposter Jason also won't count towards the overall ranking either. Also, we will go through the series in chronological order, and I'll rank them from worst to best at the end of the video. Lastly, if you're not familiar with the series and its continuity, then you may be a little lost when I go into details concerning the plots of each movie. I want to keep this video short and sweet, so with a few exceptions, I won't be diving into the lore or the plot of each movie. So, with that out of the way, let's jump in. Starting with part 2. This one is kind of boring in the grand scheme of things. Jason is sporting his baghead look in this one, and he gets fooled by Ginny into thinking that his mama is still alive. I guess that's sort of sad in a fucked up serial killer sort of way, but either way it works out for Ginny in the end, and she plunges Jason's own machete into his shoulder as his back is turned. It's an entertaining slow-mo shot, and the tension built up over the course of the third act chase has a satisfying conclusion here, but when compared to the other ways that Jason gets taken out, it's a little bit dull. Part 3. This one's iconic in my opinion, an axe straight to the dome. It even leaves a big cut in his hockey mask that is present in every iteration of the character following this event, except for Freddy vs. Jason for some reason, and for some reason it's also present in part 8, even though that's a different hockey mask, but we'll get into that later. The only thing that bothers me about this one is when the biker pops out to save the final girl at the last second and he pays for it with his life. This is why you don't try and be the hero, my friends. Just run away and let the girl die. She isn't worth it. I don't care how cute she is. I also like the lingering shot we get of Jason on the floor of the barn just laying there. Part of you almost expects him to move or jump and scare the audience, but the music just swells and it fades to black as the credits roll. It's a good creepy ending. Part 4. Again, another iconic death. Jason gets fooled again here, but this time it's by an image of his younger self mimicked by a young Tommy Jarvis. Little Tommy gets the drop on Jason and nails him on the side of the head with his machete, and when Jason falls, his head slides down the blade. It's gross, it's awesome, and it's one of the more creative ends for Jason. Of course, it doesn't end there, and Tommy goes ballistic on Jason, hacking him up as much as he can before the scene fades to white. This great attention to detail should be credited to some of the future entries here, as a lot of Jason's injuries are carried over from film to film. Some of the sequels do it better than others, however. While Michael Myers had Laurie Strode and Freddy has Nancy, Jason gets taken out here by Tommy Jarvis, and Tommy will go on to be Jason's rival for the next 2 sequels. Unfortunately, Jason isn't in Part 5, so we're going to skip that entry and move on to Part 6. Part 6. So before we get into the actual defeat of Jason here, I want to explain something. From part 2 to part 4, Jason is kind of like a lesser version of Wolverine from X-Men. He's human, but is highly resilient to pain and injury. You let him rest long enough and he'll keep getting up and continuing to fight, but he can be killed, which he is in part 4. In part 6, Jason goes from being a lesser version of Wolverine and turns more into Deadpool, which is actually a plot point that's brought up in Jason X. You can cut him up, you can burn him, you can drown him, shoot him, you can blow him up, but he'll always keep coming back. After part 6, he's basically unstoppable, and it's not so much about killing Jason, but temporarily incapacitating him. Having said that, starting with part 6, Jason is more of a zombie, or more accurately, a revenant. An older Tommy Jarvis, after years of dealing with mental anguish and psychological issues, has returned to Crystal Lake to take Jason out once and for all. Unfortunately, in his quest to burn Jason's remains, he inadvertently brings Jason back from the dead. Knowing that Jason is no longer human and is stronger than he's ever been, Tommy devises another way of stopping Jason. He lures Jason back out into Crystal Lake and he chains him to a boulder that sinks him to the bottom of the lake, trapping Jason where it all started.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
Jason's defeat in this one is probably the most grand of the bunch. It's very theatrical with a ring of fire surrounding our combatants, kind of like a Roman arena. 2 gladiators enter and only 1 leaves. Unfortunately, while Tommy succeeds in trapping Jason beneath the waves, Jason is able to get the better of him, and he chokes Tommy out under the water and lets his lifeless corpse float to the surface. If not for Megan, Tommy would have died, but thankfully she swims out to Tommy, finishes off Jason with a boat propeller to the neck, and gets Tommy back to shore where she's able to revive him, and they escape with their lives.
It's over. It's finally over. Jason's home.
The victory is only slightly minimized with the final shot of Jason's eye peering out from underneath the dark waters. Part 6 is one of my favorite entries into the series, and I highly enjoy Jason's demise here. Tom Matthews is great as an older Tommy Jarvis. He conveys just enough crazy-eyed charisma mixed with determination and obligation. Starting with Jason's demise here in Part 6, Jason becomes more synonymous with the lake in which he resides, as the next 2 sequels have Jason returning from the depths of the lake each time he comes back.
Jason belongs in hell. I'm gonna see he gets there.
Which brings us to Part 7. I know a lot about the bullshit that happened behind the scenes of this movie, with the ratings board and so on, but unfortunately I can't let that persuade me to give this ending any less flack than what I think it deserves. I feel like it's confusing, it's stupid, and even worse of all, I think it's kind of boring. For context, the idea behind Jason's death here is that Tina resurrects her father, and he rises up and drags Jason back to the bottom of the lake. Now, originally, Tina's father was supposed to look a lot like Jason, all rotted and torn up from being under the water all that time. But even if the makeup job for Tina's father was done the way it was originally intended, I still don't think that this would have worked. I mean, how does Tina even have the ability to resurrect her father anyway? Tina can move things with her mind, she has visions of the future and of events that are happening elsewhere, but how does that equate to resurrecting the dead? I just can't make that leap in logic, even with the other ridiculous elements the series has introduced thus far. The argument could be that she resurrected Jason at the beginning of the film, but in my opinion, Jason wasn't dead anyway. He was just stuck at the bottom of the lake, so all Tina did was accidentally free him. I could go on here, but I think I'll leave it at that. I could and probably will go into more depth on Part 7 as a whole in another video anyway, so I'll save the rest of my thoughts about it for later. Part 8. Ugh, what a mess. This really does break my heart because while I am an avid Kane Hodder fan, I have to admit that his reign as Jason, while iconic and well acted, the movies that he's stuck in are awful. And as for part 8, I don't even know where to start here, so let's just go with the unmasking first. What is this mess? The continuity of Jason's past injuries are gone. His lips or teeth or whatever that's supposed to be on his face, it looks like it was made with paper mache. And what is going on with his eye? It was rotted out completely in the last movie, but now it's back and it's all like droopy looking. I mean, I can't even tell what I'm looking at half the time. Alright, getting past his face. Was this ending written by an 8-year-old? What kind of an adult actually believes that toxic waste is flushed through the New York sewer system every night?
What do you mean? Toxic waste, son. The sewer floods out with this stuff every night at midnight. Less than 10 minutes from now. Come on, follow me.
Oh, and the whole thing with Jason melting away into a child version of himself is just the cherry on top of this shit sundae. I don't know if this was meant to be symbolic, but if it was not executed correctly. This whole movie feels like it was written and directed by a teenager with only a mediocre understanding of how movies are made. This whole damn movie is a joke, and every time I rewatch it, I find something new to bitch about. I just want to move on from it. Part 9. Moving on from one disaster and right into another. Part 8 was a mess of a movie, and it was a failure at the box office, so Paramount sold the rights to the Jason character over to New Line Cinema. And over at New Line, they used the character to make some of the worst sequels in the franchise. The Friday the 13th movies had already been on a steady decrease in quality in my opinion anyway, but unfortunately Part 9 does not fare any better. Having said that, the opening of Part 9 crams in almost every trope the series has to offer in the first 7 minutes of the runtime. And while they completely ignore how Jason got from the sewers of New York all the way back to Camp Crystal Lake, it's actually kind of awesome. And it all culminates in a really cool scene where Jason gets blown the fuck up. Yeah, that's right. 7 minutes in, and Jason gets got before the title screen even pops up. This death is actually great, except for like Jason's grunts of pain and the weird yell he does right before he gets blown up. That shit's just stupid. He gets like shot up like crazy, and then right when you think he's about to fall over dead, they drop a bomb on his ass. It's like a damn Mortal Kombat fatality. His head even perfectly detaches itself from his torso and flies straight up in the air and lands straight down on the ground. However, I do think I see the material they used to make the fake Jason head right here. It's all white where his head is supposed to meet his neck. I don't know what that's about. Jumping to the end of the movie, for reasons that seem hastily made up and they only apply to this sequel, Jason takes a discount Kandarian dagger straight to the chest, and as fireworks start flying out of his body, these giant puppet hands shoot out from the ground, and they presumably drag Jason down to the fiery depths of hell. In comparison, it's pretty metal seeing Jason getting dragged to hell, but I think they wasted the better kill in the opening of the film. Of course, Freddy's glove popping out of the dirt and then dragging Jason's mask down is pretty awesome. It's a pretty cool scene to end on, so I'll give it that at the very least. Alright, that brings us to Jason X. Now, it could be argued that Jason X is so bad that it's good, and I won't judge those who enjoy this entry. I found myself enjoying it from time to time. I mean, personally, I'm like 50-50 depending on the day of the week, but it's definitely not on the top of my list when it comes to a Friday the 13th marathon. So I have good memories with this one. I watched it with my best friend in his basement after we rented it from like one of those knockoff Blockbusters back in the 90s. I think it was called like Video Entertainment or something like that. We used to rent PS2s back then too. It was good times, but I digress. Jason in space is definitely a strange concept, but after the last 3 sequels, everything was getting weirder and stupider anyway, so it's not really a surprise that they went this far into the absurd. One good thing that came out of this is seeing Jason burning up in the atmosphere of an alien planet. It's an awesome death, but I do think the ending implies that Jason somehow survived this, which is insanely stupid, but since when has this series been about realism anyway? Alright, moving on to Freddy vs. Jason. Now this might be a tough one to beat. We're talking about almost 10 minutes of bloody, brutal beatdown. It's highly entertaining watching these two titans of terror throwing each other around like rag dolls. And the longer the fight's dragged out, the more brutal it gets. Thrown through windows, sliced, stabbed, fingers cut off, arms ripped off, eyes stabbed out. It's just a wonderfully messy good time. And while I think the ending sort of implies that Jason won the fight, overall I kind of see it more as a draw. I think Freddy got the upper hand on Jason, but Jason gets the final blow and an assist from our final girl. And as Jason lays floating on the surface of the lake, bloody and beaten, he gives her a sort of approving look of defeat, and he allows himself to sink to the watery depths. Jason deserves no remorse or sympathy by any means, and at the end of the day, he's a senseless killer, but Freddy vs. Jason sort of like colors him as an anti-hero, which I personally think is sort of silly, but, you know, to each their own, I suppose. I guess when you have a versus movie, one should be worse than the other, I guess, so they're trying to give someone to root for, but, I mean, at the end of the day, they're both serial killers. You shouldn't be rooting for either one of them, but anyway. Now we're at Friday the 13th, 2009. Now, because this is a remake, I feel like the movie retreads a lot of what came before, which is, you know, just comes with the territory. And while it does put a spin on some of those elements and it improves them, the ending does not feel fresh or satisfying in my opinion. I've seen Jason mentally manipulated too many damn times now. I'm not saying that it doesn't make sense or that even for this movie that the scene doesn't work, because I do think it does. But for the long-time fans of the series, it's just a boring conclusion to the movie. I mean, you could see it coming from a mile away. I also want to point out something that really bothered me. The character Clay, played by Jared Padalecki of Supernatural fame, his plot armor is just obnoxiously obvious. I mean, Jason is like full-on beast mode in this entire movie, tearing through people left and right with no hesitation or remorse. But as soon as he faces off against Clay, it's like he drank stupid juice with his breakfast that morning. The whole aspect of the final fight with Jason and Clay, it brings it down a few notches for me. That and retreading Jason's mommy issues yet again. If the movie had gotten a sequel, I would have been very interested in seeing how they would have brought Jason back, because I feel like the way that they do kill him off in this one also feels pretty final. And it would be a little unrealistic for him to survive this encounter, which normally wouldn't matter, but this movie, the remake, they kind of make Jason, well, they make him human again, and they make it, I don't know, it's more based on like a grounded reality. So it would have been very interesting to see how they would have brought him back for a sequel to this one. Alright, so that was the last one. So, if I had to rank all of his deaths in order from worst to best, this would be the ranking. Coming in at dead last would be Part 8, followed by Part 7, then Part 9, Jason X, Part 2, Friday the 13th, 2009, Part 3, Part 4, Freddy vs. Jason, and then the most satisfying demise of Jason, in my opinion, is Part 6. So yeah, that's my ranking. Do you agree or disagree with any of my thoughts? Do you want to yell at me in the comments? I'd love to hear it. Leave me a like or a dislike and let me know what your opinion is. Before I leave, I would like to throw out a bonus into the ether really quick. There is an amazing Friday the 13th fan film called Never Hike Alone, and it has 2 follow-ups, one of which just came out on October 13th. And it was an amazing watch. It brings back a few familiar faces from Jason's past. I highly recommend it to any Friday the 13th fans who have been dying for some more Jason content for the last 14 years. Anyway, that's the end of the video. So for anyone who's still here, I think in my next video I'm either going to be taking a deep dive into the new Mortal Kombat story mode, or maybe Alan Wake 2. I'm playing through that currently right now. So if that sounds like something you want to see, please subscribe. And yeah, with that, thank you for watching.
Killer buried, but not dead.